Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Here's a number that shocked me. 54% of U.S. adults read below a 6th grade level. That's not struggling readers, that's not kids, that's adults in the workforce. Adults we are promoting into management, trusting with budgets, and asking to navigate complexity, and we call them leaders. And if you zoom out even further, 21% of U.S. adults are functionally illiterate. And that's not just a statistic, that's a leadership pipeline problem. Today's episode is not about reading more books faster, it's not a productivity hack, it's not a book list. It's an argument that reading is a leadership competency, not a personality preference. The leaders who skip it are operating with slower judgment, a smaller mental toolbox, and a narrower view of the world than those who read. And that the consequences of that gap show up in real decisions on real teams with real costs. We're going to get in today what reading actually does to a leader's brain. And it's more than you might expect. We're going to challenge the idea of what literacy even means in 2026, and we're going to be honest about the limit. Reading alone doesn't make you a leader. You need to apply it as well. So Andy, before we get into research, I want to start personal. Is there a book or a reading habit or even a specific moment where something you read changed how you led? A decision that you made differently, an assumption that you caught yourself making because you read something that was connected to it or anything like that?
Oh, it's really hard to tie a specific I had this experience and I immediately thought of this thing that I read in a book. More often than not, I find things going the other way, which maybe means that I'm being too reactive in my life. But I find myself looking for books to solve problems that I am going through right now, or one of the things that I often do when I get a new manager or a new skip level or move into an organization is I ask them about the books, specifically the business books or the leadership books that had the biggest impact on them or that they would most recommend, because that helps me get inside some of their thought patterns, right? So understanding oh, this person really likes, Patrick Lenciani's books or whatever. So maybe I should brush up on that, or at least refresh some of those concepts. Right now, my current skip level is implementing some tools and practices from Traction. So I'm reading Traction so that I understand the source material that he's trying to deploy, which helps consume it just faster. But that's often how I go about things, Ed. I'm sure that there have been a bunch of instances where I've come into something that's very similar to something I've read. It's just very hard to pull one out of my brain and be like, here is that anecdote right here on the spot. But
Yeah.
that's kind of how I think about it.
For sure. And I've had it go both directions where I've been on the reactive side, or I hear something and I need to read up on it or try to shore up. And I've been on the other side. I mean, I read a lot of books, or try to every year. And sometimes you read something and it just it crystallizes something you've been thinking about, or a problem that you've been having, or it helps you understand it in a new way. And I've definitely had the opposite where I've just happened to read a book and then months later, some topic or thought or approach from it became really applicable or really useful to me. I know a couple, just off the top of my head, a couple of the books that I could say really have done that for me. And I think this one is probably for a lot of people as well, but the Phoenix Project, I think there was a lot about how they were, the operations challenges that they were facing and how they were moving into DevOps. I know that book may be a little outdated now, especially with AI and, all the orchestration work that we're doing, but that one definitely had a profound effect for me. There's a great book called Sooner, Safer, Happier. And that has a lot of patterns and anti-patterns in organizations. And so that one kind of had both. There were some of them that I was like, oh, I'm already facing this problem. And then I read the book and it helped me put words around it or understand it better. And then there was some in that book that I hadn't directly faced. And then, those concepts have been useful later on. And then the Elegant Puzzle, Will Larson's book about management, I think was another one that had like I felt both sides of that as I was reading. It was like, oh, this is relating to something I've experienced or pain I'm having, and then also there's ideas that still will sometimes I'll come back around to, or somebody will say something and I'll be like, oh, this book has this great section about that, and I'll reference it for them.
Yeah, I'm also, now that you're jogging my memory here, Ed, I'm thinking about like what color is my parachute, was critical for me, when I transitioned out of academia and into a much more corporate lifestyle, right? Understanding how to distill your core skills, I thought was really, really useful. I think it's untangling the giant hairball. It's fantastic for like navigating the complexities of just corporate organizations broadly, and figuring out what you can control and what you can influence, and what you just need to kind of roll with. I could think of a handful of others on broad life stuff that have been super impactful, but we'll kind of keep the scope of this conversation a bit more tuned towards our work life, not our personal.
Yeah. So I want to make the argument based on those literacy statistics that we just talked about at the opening here. I think my big argument for this episode is that the readership crisis is a leadership crisis. Um, Based on what I was reading, the average CEO reads approximately 60 books per year, whereas the average American reads roughly 4 books per year. And that gap, I don't think that gap could be equated to time management, right? Because we could make the argument that a lot of CEOs are very busy or traveling a lot or those types of things. So I think that it's fundamentally an indication about what these two different groups, people who read a lot and people who don't, what they believe reading does for them. Yeah, and so reading could be a self-improvement thing. You could read a lot of self-improvement books, or it could be a nice habit. But I'm really talking about the way that um, that we talk about things like financial acumen or strategic thinking as a competency, right? Leaders with high literacy, at least the research I could find, leaders with high literacy competence demonstrate 34% better problem solving and are 3 times more likely to advance to senior leadership. And that, I would say, is not a personality trait. That's an outcome based on performance.
It's a
Um,
skill, skill acquisition and skill deployment.
Yeah. So the literacy statistics are context for the pool that we're drawing leaders from. If 54% of the adult population reads below a 6th grade level, then that means that we're pulling managers and executives out of that same population. And I think that could indicate that there's a structural problem, or there could be in the future. And it's not an individual problem, but a larger structural problem. So I guess the question I wanted to ask you at this point would be, when you're working with an executive or a mid-level manager or a senior leader, do you think you can tell the difference? Do you feel like there's a detectable difference between a leader who reads broadly and how they engage with the problem and with the people around them compared to someone who doesn't read as often?
Um, I'm going to be blunt, Ed. I don't think I've worked with any leaders who are not well read. Um, I think that there is a delta between exceptionally well read and pretty well read, and we could be kind of splitting some hairs here. But I find that outside of just like broad credentialism, right? Like has MBA or doesn't have MBA, or insert whatever. Um, in this day and age, it's near impossible to ascend to the level of senior management without being rather well read. And I'll expand that a bit, right? So, I know you talked about like how many books a CEO reads versus the average American. I think that that's a good heuristic. I think that folks sometimes get hung up on the idea of finishing a book, right? I started book, therefore must finish book. I've been a huge proponent of 100 pages minus your age. So if you're not hooked after whatever 100 pages minus your age is on a given book, you should move on and read another book. A lot of business books these days, you can kind of cherry pick, like you don't need to read the whole book to get the information that you're after. You can read the selected chapters that focus on the problem that you're trying to solve, right? Or the things that are most pertinent to you. And all of that counts. right? Reading HBR articles counts. Like all of this counts. So I want to just emphasize like your book count, like what your Goodreads account looks like, is not like a direct linear pathway to kind of how well read you are. Um, but I don't think I know any leaders who are not well read in this day and age. And to kind of drill down on it a bit more, right? As we see like conversational AI taking over, right? I think most of us are using ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or whatever a lot in our day to day life. That means that we're reading more, right? And that functional literacy, not just your ability to read quickly, right, which is to a certain extent a skill. I don't believe that speed reading actually exists. It's a matter of like gaining the density of the information in the most efficient way that you can. But we have to read a lot more, right? Because you're going to say to Claude, Claude, do this thing or write this thing for me. And your input is, a paragraph or two or whatever, and its output is 8 pages, right? So that I think it's just becoming an increasingly critical skill in our day in and day out life. And then that discernment, that ability to edit is becoming also increasingly critical. I think we're seeing a lot more organizations move towards a writing culture. Overall, right? Amazon has been, known for years and years and years about its document culture, right? Everything there happens through documents. Don't you dare present a slide deck internally. So I think as a skill, it's just like beyond critical at this point. And I think that if you are not well read, you're doing yourself a major disservice. And I will say that like I see a lot of leaders, myself included, go through like fits and spurts, right? So like right now, I'm not doing a whole lot of reading. At other points in my life, I'm a voracious reader, right? And that's okay too, right? It's the sum totality of the amount of reading that you've done that really has the impact, not necessarily like just the hardcore consistency of, Ed reads 25 pages a day in and day out without fail. That's awesome and super aspirational. But folks, please understand that you might read 3 books in a week, and then you might not read for 2 months, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and I definitely go through fits and starts like that myself. Thinking about this idea, I I have worked with leaders who don't read very much. And it's not sometimes you meet people who almost seem proud where they're like, I haven't read a book since high school or whatever. I haven't read a book since college. And I never get that kind of vibe from people in
No,
the,
and
yeah,
that's so driven and I think like our kind of millennial generation of like trying hard was super uncool when we were in middle school and high school. And I feel like folks who carried that into their adult life are not the kind of folks that we should admire.
yeah.
Just to be blunt about it again.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, and I mean, I would say, I don't encounter that level of like, I don't read any books, but I definitely have encountered people who don't read very much, or there's no problem with reading fiction, but I think, maybe only reading fiction when you're trying to move up the chain and things like that. And when I've worked with those types of leaders who aren't reading widely, the kind of things that I notice is that they're the way that they can think through problems, the way that they can understand new context that's brought to them, or the way that they make decisions all feels kind of lacking in certain ways. It's like everything is limited to just their own personal experience, which is
Mm.
limited by definition. Like we only have so much hours in a day and so much capacity to do
So much time
things,
in our
and
lives.
yeah,
Yeah.
and opportunities for experiences. So I think that at least what my experience has been is that um, that leaders who read less or maybe don't read very much at all tend to generalize more without evidence. They might make assumptions that they can't defend. And I don't think it's being careless. I think it's just that they genuinely have a smaller set of like reference points that they can draw
Mhm.
from. Because reading is a way that you can borrow other people's experience without having to live it yourself, right? And that's why I think even reading fiction
Yeah.
can be beneficial because it can give you perspectives into other ways of life or ways of thinking or those types of things that can broaden your perspective.
Yeah, and a couple of things on that too, right? Is like one of the things you notice, right? And this has been super broad across all subjects, is the more expertise somebody has in a given subject, typically the more humble they are about their expertise, right? And a good way to think about this, right, is if you live in a super dense forest and you've got a clear cut circumference of, I don't know, 20 feet, right? So you've got this radius, right, that you can see, and you're like, okay, I've got this clear cut piece, and I can see that, and you see what's around you, right? And you've got this kind of, you have these this 20 feet or whatever it is. That's what you don't know, right? As that circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the like area that you're touching that you don't know gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with that, right? In kind. Um, and that's why, yeah, you see some of these like Dunning-Kruger effects, right? Or some of these things where like people who know very little think that they know a whole lot. And it's like it's explicitly because they don't know a lot about something that they think they know everything about it. And on that, right? I know, recently we talked about Stoicism. There's a great line from Zeno, right? So Zeno, who's one of the founders of Stoicism, consulted the Oracle of Delphi, and the Oracle of Delphi revealed that to live the best life, one must have conversations with the dead. And what Zeno realized is what the Oracle was saying is you have to read, right? You can't make all of the mistakes yourself. Somebody somewhere has been in the situation that you've been in, and they either made the right choice or they made the wrong choice, and they wrote a book about it, right? So if you're trying to figure out how to solve a problem, almost 100% of the time somebody has solved either that exact problem or a close enough problem, and you can learn from their experiences rather than falling off the bicycle yourself.
Or they failed, and you can learn how they failed, and you can at least avoid that
And
failure.
yeah, avoid failing in that specific way for
Yeah.
sure.
So let's talk about what reading actually does to a leader's brain. Um, what changes does it make, and what's the absence if what's the cost of absence if you're not doing it? And there are four mechanisms that I picked out that I think are all relevant here. The first one is decision making and mental models. Reading, especially if you read biographies, history, and narrative nonfiction, it can let you run mental simulations of complex problems without the real world cost of being wrong. So it's not just about acquiring information from the books that you're reading, it's actually a process where you can build judgment. And it may not be personal experience, but you are basically building experience through the experience of others. So the leader who has read, six different accounts of how a particular organization navigated a crisis has a much different perspective, and is able to make decisions in a completely different way than someone who has never experienced or read anything about a particular crisis and is just inside of it for the very first time. Um, so I think decision making and mental models is a big one.
Mhm.
Next up would be empathy and theory of mind. And I think this one sometimes surprises people. There was a 2013 study in Science, and the study found that reading literary fiction measurably improves theory of mind, which is the ability to infer what other people are thinking and feeling. So for a leader, that's really valuable, right? That might be a soft skill, but it even goes beyond that because that can impact things like talent management, negotiation, reading a room. So I think based on this and the idea that you can learn to think more like how other people might think and feel, means that reading fiction is not just a luxury, that it actually can help you boost your emotional intelligence, like your EQ, and you can get stronger in that area by reading. Next up is cognitive sharpness and focus. There's a cognitive scientist, Keith Stanovich, who did some research that found that consistent reading preserves mental agility over time. Um, reading requires sustained attention, where social media skimming actively degrades it. So every leader who has replaced reading with scrolling is basically trading one type of cognitive exercise for something that's almost its opposite. But by practicing reading, it does sharpen your thinking approach, and it helps you to take in more information and process it and sort it and organize it and figure out what to do with it. And then the last one I found that I thought was interesting was stress regulation. The University of Sussex found that reading reduces stress levels by up to 68%. Their research found it was more effective than music and even more effective than going for a walk. So, for a leader who's maybe in a high stress situation with a lot of cortisol, reading, so, sometimes I think people view reading as like uh, uh, taking a break or being on a retreat or whatever. But it can be that, it can be a break, but it can also be an actual active recovery process, and recovery practice that makes it so you can sustain your performance over a longer period of time. So, how do those resonate with you? Do you think that any of these are undervalued, or do you think that people think they can get these anywhere else? And is there anything else that you see that you think is valuable from reading?
Yeah, I think it's like, I think it's a great summary again, Ed. And like, I think it's really easy to undervalue the empathy side of things. In my in the circles that I've been in for the last like 20 years or so, I feel like most of the folks I know read a whole heap of nonfiction and see have historically kind of looked down a bit on fiction. I when I moved into this office, I very deliberately made the visible bookshelf full almost entirely of fiction, because I was tired of just like having this, look at me, look at all the business books behind me vibe that I'd chosen previously. But I think that ability to empathize, that ability to get into the like mind of another character is really really helpful. It's helpful for creative thinking, it's helpful for understanding. I think also, like, as we read more and like as I'm sure you've experienced in your life, I've certainly experienced in my life, as I've gotten older, right, and I've had more success, my life has become increasingly sheltered. I live in a nice, super quiet suburb where my neighbors are people who are very, very much like me, right? Reading gives me an opportunity to learn a lot more about the lives of people who are very much not like me. In fact, some of the favorite books that I've read over the last 10 years or so have been memoirs of people who've led wildly different lives than I could ever imagine. And I think that really helps us understand, the broader social context of what's going on, right? It helps us understand the vast majority, like that the vast majority of the folks that we work with and interact with, like, haven't had the life that you've had, and like they could be this or they could be that, or they could have experienced this or they could have experienced that. And that grows empathy, it grows understanding, and it helps you grow patience. And one of the things too, right, kind of getting back to what you're saying is like the person who's read 6 books on this subject, that your organization is going through, is the person who's like never experienced it, never read anything. James Mattis would say that, like, if you haven't read 100 books on like your broad domain of like whatever it is you do, you are functionally illiterate, right? And I think that we often we think like, I am literate because I can read. And while that's technically true, functionally it's false, right? You are literate because you do read, right? It's incumbent upon you to use that skill deliberately to increase your skills or increase your knowledge about what it is that you're doing. So just because you can read, if you have not been reading, then for all intents and purposes, there's no difference between you and the person next to you who cannot read.
Yeah. Well, and that sets me up perfectly for the next point I wanted to bring up about literacy, which it's more than reading the words. Like to your point, not reading, being able to do it and not doing it, you're functionally illiterate. I would also contend that even if you read 100 books or 500 books, but you don't do anything with them, then there's still some kind of gap in your
Mhm.
literacy. Because I think it's not just about reading the material. It's about evaluating what it is you're consuming. Other types of literacy like media literacy, data literacy, science literacy. All of those are areas that you need to be able to, especially nowadays, like what is misinformation or disinformation, what is made up completely just because there's some conspiracy theory or rumor or something that's being spread around. And especially in an environment with all sorts of AI generated content, if you can't interrogate a source, then that can be a liability for you, right? If you can't evaluate if it's accurate or if it's misleading, then that's going to cause problems. And that doesn't mean that someone is unintelligent, right? You can be very intelligent but still do surface level reading and just scroll past a headline or skim a summary, and you'd be missing out on that analytical thinking and that deep reading and thinking through what you've read in a meaningful way. And research does show that readers, people who read a lot, are significantly better at detecting misinformation than non-readers. So the evidence seems to point towards the idea that the practice of reading things closely, questioning them, and even this idea of like holding two ideas in tension with one another. I think a lot of people want things to be black or white or this or that, and a lot of times two ideas can both be true in different ways, and they might be at tension with one another. So people who read more, the evidence shows that this cognitive habit transfers directly to how you evaluate information in a meeting or in a market analysis or when a crisis happens. And when we look at history, Marcus Aurelius, he kept a private journal of philosophy while he was commanding an entire empire. Lincoln, he read tons of books. He was like a voracious reader, and he read all throughout the Civil War. Um, there's a lot of leaders who, and you look at their biographies or what they actually did during their time period, they were heavy readers, and they weren't reading just to collect facts. Especially, nowadays we have so many business books and things like that, but back then there wasn't like, Abraham Lincoln didn't have a book he could read about how to deal with a civil war. He had to read about other leaders and other experiences and other conflicts that had happened and learn from those things. So really, all of those leaders who read, you're building an internal architecture that makes it possible for you to make sound judgment under pressure. So I think we both know leaders who quote books all the time, and they seem to always have a framework ready or they cite the latest research, but they're still remarkably ineffective. What do you think's going on there? What do you feel like is the difference between a leader who reads and a leader who, I guess I would say, like, who leads from what they read?
Yeah, I think it's almost the difference between trivia and knowledge, right? Like it's one thing to be able to, answer the questions on Jeopardy, right? It's another thing to be able to actually explain the concept, or be able to kind of pull through it. I think some folks will get very good at memorizing facts or memorizing quotes, but they fail to be able to actually connect that to like the fascia of what's really going on, right? So everything kind of becomes this like trite, banal platitude, and it's sort of like a circus trick, right? And I think that's really where it comes down to, right? Is like you can read the book, but have you actually applied the knowledge from the book, in something, right? Or did you fully understand it, or did you read it just that you can cherry pick like this line from this person and this line from this person, right? So like there's also a difference in the way that you go about reading, right? So are you reading exclusively to have like witty quips that you can share, um or did you really kind of dive in and do the work and truly understand the source material? There was I'm going to mess this story up, but to kind of I'm gonna again reference ancient Rome. How often do two dudes get together and talk about the ancient Romans? But there's a very wealthy man who had actually hired for himself. He bought out all of the most well-read slaves. And at these dinner parties and whatnot, he would have his slaves around, and his slaves would basically feed him the information that he needed to present himself as as a an intelligent and well-read person. And one of his guests one time said to him, he goes, "Well, next I think you should try wrestling." And he goes, "Why would I do that? I'm an old man." And he goes, "Yes, but your slaves are young." Right. So like you can have all the quips, you can have all the witticisms, but if you don't have the actual depth of the knowledge behind them, then they're just platitudes. And I think some folks get hung up on the presentation and they miss like the depth that they were truly trying to understand.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, because reading is an input. Reading is an input, and leadership is an output, right? Like you
Mhm.
could read 500 books in a year, and just take them all in. But if you're not having it turn into the value that you need out of that reading, then it didn't really do anything for you in the first place, right? Like if you're analysis paralysis. Maybe you've read so many things you can't pick what you should use.
Mhm.
Or
Mhm.
I think we've seen leaders who accumulate frameworks but they never actually change their behavior. Like, hey, here's this new framework, but we're gonna call it that, but we're gonna still do the old behavior on
Still
top of
do,
it.
yeah, still do the same thing. Or another way, like, look, you can read a book about riding a bike, but there's a difference between reading a book about riding the bike and knowing what it's like to balance on two wheels and feel the wind in your hair, and knowing what it's like to fall off and lose some skin to the tarmac and whatnot. Or if you think I think the therapist's character sums it up really beautifully in Good Will Hunting, right? When they're sitting on the park bench and he talks about all the different, like, I ask you about love, you can quote, Shakespearean sonnets to me, but you don't know dot dot dot, right? I think folks get hung up in that of like, I acquired all the information, but I didn't apply it to actual experience, right? Like it's not lived, it's in my brain, but it's not in my bones.
Yeah, I mean, think about how many leaders that you've seen or heard of who like talk about psychological safety, but they don't create psychologically safe environments.
Mhm.
Or they talk about growth mindset, but they don't let anybody grow. I think there's all sorts of examples of that where they quote the book at the team, but they don't actually model whatever the book is describing, or even what they're claiming that they took to heart so much they're not even
Right.
actually
It,
doing
be-
it.
it becomes like a cargo cult mentality. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's basically like reading without synthesis, and then without application, and without almost like a willingness to let what you've learned challenge how you operate and change how you operate. You're just collecting information. You're not actually growing or developing as a leader. So, we're talking about reading being leading, but the goal is not just to read more. The goal would be to become a leader reader, someone where your reading practice is actually shaping your judgment, your decisions, the people around you, the work that you do, and it actually influences and changes your approach instead of just being information that you collect but do nothing with.
Yeah. Totally agree.
So, what does a leader reader actually look like in practice? How can we start building this habit and have some intention around it rather than just saying, like, hey, you need to read 500 books next year? I thought of four tactics that I would recommend. The first one is read adjacent, not just aligned. I think a lot of leaders default to reading within their industry. It might be trade press or business books or market reports, and that is necessary reading. If you're not doing that today, you definitely should be. That's probably a good starting point to help you shore up your
Table
knowledge.
stakes.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
basically table stakes. But that in and of itself is not going to be enough. It's not sufficient. So, what I might recommend is before your next significant decision or maybe before a big, difficult conversation, spend some time with something adjacent to the problem. Maybe it's a biography, maybe it's a historical case study, or maybe it's a work of fiction where there's an event that happens in it that's similar to what you need to be, to the interaction that you're going to be having. The goal isn't that it's going to give you the answer. It's just that it will create space and help you slow your thinking down enough so that you can maybe ask some more questions and kind of work through these problems in a more meaningful way. Number two, name what you're reading and why. I think one of the most powerful signals that a leader can send is making their learning visible. Andy already talked about how he'll reach out and ask, like, what are the big business books that everybody's talking about here that are influencing the decisions here? If you're in that leadership position, just take that step and do it actively. Mention a book that you finished in a team meeting. And you have to find the right balance. We're not trying to do this to perform intellectualism. We're trying to model that you are learning and growing and developing as a leader as we go. That you're a work in progress. You're not a finished product. And I think by sharing those things, if you didn't learn anything from it and you share it, your team's probably going to know because you won't be able to talk about it. So it also gives you kind of an incentive to think more deeply about what you're reading so you can share it with other people. Number three would be separate surface reading from analytical reading. Start thinking about reading in two categories. One category is broad intake. It's articles, news, industry content. And that's the kind of stuff that you need to keep moving, right? You need to always be reading new stuff. You need to be finding the most up to date or the most current. But the second category of reading should be slower and more deliberate. Maybe that's a chapter a day from something substantive, right? It might be a classic novel or some big textbook style book like that seems like a tome that you're not sure if you're ever going to get through it. And go slow and try to actually reflect on what it is you're reading. If you're only reading from that first category, from that broad intake, then you're basically consuming and you may not be developing yourself from what you're reading. And then the fourth thing for me that I thought of was track the application, not just the volume. So don't just count how many books per year. I mean, you could do that too. I like to keep my Goodreads up to date, and the years I have the most books, I definitely feel good about myself. But there have been years where I've read a lot of books and I don't remember very much from a bunch of them. So try to track that application a little bit more. As you're reading, maybe take notes, or after you finish reading something, write down one decision that you made differently or that you might make differently in the future. Or maybe think about assumptions that you had that what you read corrected. If you can't name something that changed for you from what you read, even if it was just reaffirming a perspective that you already had, then it might indicate that the reading didn't fully land yet. So this helps you have a metric that is more about your behavior as opposed to how many pages you read, and can help you reflect on, like, am I spending enough time doing the analytical piece or reading deeply or really thinking about these things? Because if you're finding it's not changing anything for you, if you're not doing things differently or it's not reaffirming or confirming things that you already thought to be true, then you might not be getting any value out of what you're reading at all. So, anything else come to mind for you? And do any of those stand out most to you or that you'd most recommend for folks?
Yeah, one of the things I also kind of want to bring up too, and I'll apologize to my wife in advance for this. Don't be afraid to abuse your books, right? It's, obviously, if you're borrowing a book from a friend or from the library, right, you should return it in, in very similar condition to what you received it in. But if you're talking about purchasing books, like, take notes, write in the margins, dog ear pages, put flags on them, right? Be an active consumer of what you're reading, because then you can reference those pieces before, right? Or later, excuse me. It's also not a bad practice to start like a commonplace book, right? As you hear, as you read a good line or something that you need to remember, you like put that into a commonplace book, right? Retain that for future knowledge, right? Most of the great thinkers yeah, I mean, for centuries now, have maintained commonplace books. Also, if you're trying to figure out how to start or where to start, especially when we're talking about like business oriented books, don't overthink it. There are so many books out there that are just like wonderful starting points that pretty much everyone has read or everyone has had on their bookshelf at one time or another, right? You'd be hard pressed to find somebody like a- any leader out there who doesn't have a copy of, well, I think it's what Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People on their bookshelf, right? It's a good place to start. You have the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, also a great place to start, right? Like this is like, career 101, like survey course start sort of reading. But these are good texts to revisit, right? If you're trying to figure out like, how do I build my library? How do I go about this? Ask the people you respect, what book has had the biggest impact on you? What book do you come back to the most? Or just simply, what's your favorite business book? Or do you have any recommendations of books that I should read? It's a great way to build a relationship, right? It's a great way to kind of accelerate trust. You can take the Ben Franklin principle and ask them if you can borrow that book from them. And strangely enough, they will become more beholden to you because they have done you a favor. It's an interesting, weird little psychological trick. Not that I'm encouraging people to be tricky, um, but these are things like, this is a practice that takes time to develop. It's hard to maintain. As Ed and I have talked about, right? It's okay to go in fits and spurts. It's okay to not always be 100% consistent. It's easier to go be consistent. Like the labor, it's like, oh, I'm going to read 5 pages a day or 10 pages a day or whatever. But let yourself be like, okay, I'm just going to power through something. Like, find a book you like, read it voraciously, and then take a break. Like, that's all okay. And figure out what works for you, right? The way that I read is different, so than the way that Ed reads. I know, Ed, you're a much bigger consumer of audiobooks than I am, for example. I also kind of only really like print media. I feel like I'm losing something when I read on like a Kindle or an iPad. My wife, for example, does not buy books, does not keep books, only reads them digitally, and her pace, like over the duration of the year, the amount that she reads compared to me is like 8x. So maybe she's doing something right from her point of view there, right? But it's everything works kind of differently for everyone else. So figure it out. Some reading is better than no reading. And don't be afraid to not finish the book. Get what you need out of it. And if you got what you need, you can move on. You don't need to be like, oh, just grinding my way through this book. If that turns you off from reading, just put it down, find something else. At any given point, I've got like 12 books within arm's reach of me, and like 5 of them I'm reading, and it's fine.
I mean, if you check my Goodreads, I think it says I have like 75 books in progress right now because I'll start reading something, and if I'm not pushing through it or whatever, sometimes I'll give up on a book completely, but a lot of times I'll just start something else, and eventually, if I keep reading a little bit at a time, I'll get through it. I do think I fully agree with find what works best for you. Um, you know, Somebody asked me a number of years ago, like how I read so many books in the year, and it was just a lot of small, simple habits that, like Andy said, sometimes I'm stronger and sometimes I'm weaker. I don't think I've read as much this year as I have in years past, but like I like audiobooks because I sometimes take things in an auditory way that I pick them up a little bit better. So being able to just like pop on an audiobook while I'm in the car or mowing the grass or running to the grocery store or something is all those, even if it's only 5 minutes at a time, that adds up. I do like reading digital books. I have a Kindle, so I'm not saying that you should necessarily buy a Kindle per se, but if that's if carrying around a book is a barrier for you, or if the books you want to carry around are too big and heavy to do that, maybe a digital reader would be a way to help with that. And one thing I do like about Kindles specifically is I use Readwise as a tool. So when I'm reading a Kindle book, I can highlight things. I
Hmm.
actually have a Kindle Scribe, so I can even underline them or write notes in the margins and things like that. And then Readwise has a process by which it'll pull in my highlights, and it surfaces, 10 of them a day, which you do have to open the app and review them to have it be useful. But knowing that that's there, as maybe a replacement for scrolling Reddit or doom scrolling the news or something, it can remind you of quotes that you haven't thought of in a while. It can help you think about books that you haven't read. And sometimes I see a highlight and I'm like, why did I even highlight this? This is not useful to me anymore, and I'll get rid of it. And
Hmm.
sometimes a highlight pops up that I'm like, oh man, I haven't thought about this in 2 years since I read that book, but this was a really, really helpful reminder today. So anything you can do just to put in small steps that make that practice easier. Maybe lay down in bed a little bit earlier and read a book for a few minutes. There's a lot of research that shows that reading fiction before bed can help kind of calm your mind and help you get a higher quality sleep. So that might be a great place
Hmm.
to do it. Sometimes I'll wake up early in the morning and spend 15, 20, 30 minutes making sure I'm reading first thing in the morning. And sometimes it's books, sometimes it's keeping up with the news or what's going on. Um, but for me personally, the more I read, a lot of times the better I feel, and the less I read,
Yeah.
the more I like, oh, I should be reading more. And
Yeah.
that's kind of the itch that I feel.
Yeah, and just kind of one last point on that too, right? If you're trying to if you're one of those people who hasn't read a book since high school, right? A great entry point to that too, right? We talked about like reading fiction before bed. You're seeing more and more and more media come out that's based on books, right? I'm watching Bad Monkey right now on Apple TV, which is based on a novel, right? There's all the Jack Ryan series is out there, right? That's based on Tom Clancy books. There's the Jack Reacher stuff, which is based on Lee Child books. These are just the ones I can think of off my head. Don't judge my taste too too harshly here, but the point I'm getting at is that there's probably some media out there that you like, that you really enjoyed, that was based on a novel or a series of novels. That's a fantastic jumping off point, right? I'll take the Jack Reacher stuff. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. They're dirty beach reads, right? If you saw Rooster, which is also another awesome television show with Steve Carell, right? He plays an author who basically writes books like that. Um, they're fun. They're easy to read. There's like 50 of them. You can burn through them in like 5 or 6 cumulative hours of reading times. They 2 movies worth of actual time. But it's a fantastic jumping off point to just start to build the practice and realize like, oh, like actually this can be super fun. And I promise you, whatever it is that you're into, there's a genre of literature that is exactly that thing. And the easiest way to do that, in my opinion, is to think about the TV shows that you like, think about the movies that you like. A lot of them are probably based on books or inspired by books. Either read the one from the show or from the movie that you liked. Sometimes it's really cool to be like, oh, I'm going to read the book from the movie that I saw. That can be really, really fun. Uh, or read one adjacent to it, right? If you liked Jack Reacher, then read one of the other ones, right? Like it's the stories, it's going to have the same like general feel and vibe. And it's a great jumping off point to kind of build that practice and do it in a pretty low risk way of like, more likely than not, you're going to like this because you liked the thing that was right next to it.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to close out today. So, our argument has been that reading is not a personality trait for certain kinds of leaders, it's a performance variable. The decision making advantage, the empathy gap, the cognitive sharpness, stress regulation, those are not abstract benefits. They show up in how your team experiences you, in the quality of your judgment under pressure, and in how long you can sustain the kind of leadership that earns trust. The readership crisis in this country is real, and it is quietly producing a generation of leaders who are making decisions on assumptions, who are generalizing without evidence, and who are getting outmaneuvered by leaders with bigger mental toolboxes. And that's a systematic problem. But the fix, at least at the individual level, is entirely in your hands. So here are 2 challenges for you this week. First, before your next major decision or difficult conversation, see if you can find something that you can read that's adjacent to it. Not a summary or a how-to, but maybe there's a biography or a history book or a novel where one of the characters or the historical figure has gone through something vaguely similar to your decision or your conversation. Just take a little time, read about it, and notice whether it changes what you see. That's practice. Second, and sit with this question honestly. Are you a reader or are you a leader reader? Are you letting what you consume actually challenge how you operate? Are you accumulating information and protecting your existing assumptions? The difference between those 2 things is not just what's on your bookshelf, it's whether reading has ever made you change a belief that you were comfortable holding. So we'd love to hear from you on this one. Have you had a book genuinely shift how you lead? Or have you watched a leader whose lack of reading showed up as a real and costly blind spot? Tell us. We want specific stories, not just general answers. You can reach us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or connect with us on LinkedIn. If this conversation felt worth your time, please follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone you know who is serious about growing as a leader. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.